So friends, as we continue our journey through creation, we pause today to give thanks for the creation of the earth. This place, this planet, which is our home. An apt thing to do, seeing as this past week, Thursday in fact, we celebrated Earth Day. But this morning we give thanks for the creation of definition upon the face of the deep, for the gathering of the waters in which God called sea, and with that, the revealing of dry land and vegetation was called forth. Continents, plants, trees. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, on the third day. If you have been following our sermon series, then you know that liturgically we are in what can best be described as a liminal season, an in-between time. The resurrection of Jesus has taken place, yet we await the day of Pentecost when the transformative power of the Holy Spirit will once again be upon us. We are between major events in the life of Christian tradition. Author Susan Beaumont has written extensively on this topic. She says, quote, "The simplest way to describe liminality is to say it's a threshold moment. The in-between space when you are neither here nor there." She goes on to describe liminality as being a very rich time for organizations and institutions, for when used well, a liminal season allows for rediscovery and immense creativity. The challenge of liminality, however, is that because of the disorientation that comes with it, it requires a fundamentally different way of being. The old ways of doing things no longer apply. And we know change is never easy. Let's take, for example, or for instance, the council in Jerusalem that we just heard about. It was recorded for us in that 15th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. Well, it can be said that the early church was in an extreme season of liminality. In the months and years following Jesus' death and resurrection, his disciples and his followers, many of whom were devout Jews, were trying to make sense of the life-altering events they had experienced. They knew that things were different, but it wasn't as if Jesus had left a set of blueprints for the creation of the church, and I mean that capital C. Rather, what they had were their memories of what they had heard and seen, of what Jesus had instructed, the way he had lived. And they were trying to figure out, as people of faith, how to weave together the religious practices of their ancestors and this new mandate that Christ had given to them. Friends, the early church was all about trying to bring together law and love, adapting to a new way of being. Think about it. That's what the Council of Jerusalem was about. Circumcision for generations had been the mark of one's salvation, the singular mark of one's salvation. It was the law of Moses. It was written in the Torah. And so when Paul and Barnabas arrive in Jerusalem and announce that along the way, they had converted many Gentiles to the way of Jesus, but had not required the males to be circumcised, there was a lot of debate. A liminal season to be sure, a time in which our forebears had to consider and discern and move from the past into the future. A season in which the people of God had to do a lot of shifting and changing and adapting, deciding what practices made sense to take with them and what just no longer served them in the ways they once had. So let's go back to creation for a moment. Again, today we are focusing on that third day, the creation of the earth, sea, dry land, and vegetation. One of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about plants is their ability to adapt when they are in danger or to the unknown. I mean, think about it. As human beings, even as animals, what do we do when we find ourselves in danger? We move, right? We move away from what has potential to harm us, or away from the discomfort of what we may not know. Which means that plants are actually the most adaptable species created by the divine. You see, in order to survive, plants must adapt, they must change, or they die. Let's look at this for a minute. Plants do this in a myriad of ways. First, one of the ways that plants adapt is they bend because of gravity and light. Did you know that plants can sense gravity? In fact, plants have special cells in the tips of their roots, which can detect even the slightest change in gravity. Which is why if you were to tip a plant on its side and leave it that way, you would find that the plant would grow upward and the roots would immediately begin to search downward. Or light. Consider the sunflower, how it literally turns every day as the sun makes its way across the sky, or a houseplant which over time begins to grow towards the left or the right, depending on where the window is. Plants can also detect the daily cycle of light and darkness. Some plants open their leaves during the day so the plant can collect sunlight, and at night they actually close their leaves so they can contain any water that might have gotten to them. Many plants also respond to the change in the length of day. We know this. As days grow shorter, some plants respond by going dormant. And here in New England, we get to see this artistry in the fall foliage. But trees do this in order to survive, not for our beautification. Shorter days signal the coming of winter, and winter in most areas means extreme cold and little hydration. Plants and trees also have ways of protecting themselves against disease. I find this fascinating. Typically, their first line of defense is the death of part of the plant, which prevents infection from spreading. But many plants also produce special chemicals to fight disease. For example, a willow tree produces a chemical to kill bacteria. Interestingly, it's the same compound used in many acne products that we as human beings use. These chemicals may also be produced to warn other plants, thus allowing a nearby plant to prepare for the threat of its health. All this is to say, plants may be rooted in place, unable to move about freely as we do. Yet plants are far from helpless. I want us to consider a few other unique yet extreme environments where plants have adapted and evolved with special traits to help them survive. Aquatic plants, for instance. Living in water certainly has its benefits, but aquatic plants face challenges, mainly around reproduction, as pollination by wind or animals can't happen underwater, which is why many aquatic plants have floating flowers or leaves. Think about a water lily with its bowl-shaped flowers, or cattails with their narrow strap-like leaves, or even seaweed that thrives completely submerged, a plant that has its own air bubble in each leaf that provides the necessary space for the exchange of oxygen from the water to the plant, while it also keeps it upright. By contrast, there are plants and environments that do not get enough water. These plants, who make their home in arid regions, often among our planet's deserts, need to have large water intake systems. They need to be able to conserve water, and they need to be able to store water. The Saguaro Cactus is an example of one of these plants that has adapted in all three of these ways. The saguaro also doesn't have any leaves, which is where water can be lost, and it has thorns to protect the stem from thirsty animals. Rainforests, on the other hand, are layered. Tall trees that canopy the forest catch much of the light that shines down, which forces plants below to adapt in all sorts of interesting ways. Large leaves, bright colors, venomous properties, even a technique which is called piggybacking, where one plant will actually grow out of another, thus using the same resources. The Arctic, on the other hand, is totally different still. The Arctic tundra is characterized by permafrost, a layer of soil and partially decomposed organic matter that is frozen year-round. Only a thin layer of soil, called the active layer, thaws and refreezes each year, which means that everything that grows in the Arctic, including flowering plants, dwarf shrubs, herbs, grasses, mosses, and lichen, do so with extremely shallow root systems. Friends, all of these are examples of the ways in which plants and vegetation in our natural world have adapted over time. Which means that on the third day of creation, when God separated the seas from the dry land and dreamt up this magnificence of plants yielding seed of every kind and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it, God also birthed adaptability. So what the heck does this all mean for us today? I'd actually argue that it means everything for us living in April of 2021. You see, friends, we have been living through extraordinary times, times in which our ability to adapt, to change based on the conditions in which we are currently living is actually key to our survival. And I don't think that can actually be overstated. But the good news is there's precedent. You see, it isn't unlike those folks. We aren't unlike those folks living in the first century, who had experienced a major life-changing event, who were trying to figure out who and how they needed to be in the world according to an entirely different paradigm. For generations, they had followed the law of Moses, albeit sometimes more closely than at other times. That was the tradition. That was the way it was done. That was what was known and understood and accepted as common practice. And then this rabbi, this teacher, Jesus, came along and upended everything. He ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. He healed on the Sabbath. He said that the first would be last and the last would be first. He proclaimed freedom for prisoners and elevated the young. He turned power structures upside down, unapologetically proclaimed love and justice were the way forward. And then in a bold act that defied it all, he had the audacity to rise, to say, even death cannot, will not keep me from you. And that's why I love this story from Acts. You see, I don't think this really has anything to do with circumcision. It has to do with how we understand ourselves as being able to adapt to the new things that God is doing with us and in our world. For me, it's like we get to drop down into what was a liminal season for God's people. We get to watch and experience our ancestors adapting to what was totally new. We get to learn from their mistakes and from their successes. You see, friends, what Paul and Barnabas and women and men like them were trying to do was to reimagine, recreate a whole new world according to the way of Jesus. Now, I want to be fair. Liminal space, the work of adapting to what is new and unknown, is not easy, and we need to be really clear and upfront about that. But it is good and holy work. I want to go back to Susan Beaumont, who is that writer that speaks so much about liminality, and she put it this way. She said, as dangerous as liminal seasons can be, they can also be transformative. A malleable situation invites experimentation and risk-taking. We are free to question tradition, which can make space for originality, generativity, and creativity. All truly great innovations, she says, are incubated in liminality. God's greatest works occur in liminal space. I love that. God's greatest works occur in liminal space. Beloveds, I believe that one of the greatest gifts that is coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we all get to look around and make decisions, not in some far-off time, but now. We get to look around and make decisions about how it is we will adapt. We get to ask questions we maybe never had before thought to ask. We get to be curious. What makes sense and what doesn't anymore? What served us well in the past? Does it still serve us well today? With new sensibilities, we can look at things like governance structures. Please don't start to snore. But we have the opportunity to do this, to look at something like a complex system which has been created over time as a way of helping to define our work together. Does it still function? Does it still make sense? Or how about our building? How can we adapt this mammoth structure to better utilize our resources? What do we think about the ways we can adapt to be greener, to lessen our carbon footprint? These are questions that in this moment we have the opportunity to ask. Or how about membership practices? Just think, I'm here right now preaching in a basically empty room. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 7 of us, 8 of us in this room. Something that 14 months ago would have seemed absolutely inconceivable. And yet we are connecting now with more people than ever. You are in Europe. You are in South America. You are in Mexico and Canada. You are in Florida and Georgia and Arizona and Minnesota and South Carolina and Wisconsin. You're in New York City and in Boston. I want to share with you a story from an article I read recently. A friend gave it to me. And this is an article that talks about the rise of digital church, and I just want to share this with you. After spending 5 years living abroad, Beth Schultz looked forward to reconnecting with church life in 2016 when her family returned to Portland, Oregon. But she easily gets overwhelmed in groups, she says, and she didn't feel a warm welcome at her church. She tried practicing faith independently, but habits were hard to sustain with no community support. All that changed last year, however, when joining another church became an option, a church that was 2,000 miles away. Ms. Schultz began worshiping at a church in Dallas, one of the many making room during the pandemic for new virtual members who only attend online. Beth Schultz says she watches services on YouTube in her bathrobe, and she attends social gatherings on Zoom, and she's glad to be rid of what she calls the judgment factor. As a virtual member, Beth gives to her church to support its mission and its ministry, and she is even a liturgist during worship on some Sundays. Friends, it is a pandemic shift no one saw coming at the start of 2020. Churches had long assumed their members would live nearby and no longer resigned to geographic constraints. So this is just an example. It's an example of one way that churches are having to adapt, that we as the people of God are having to adapt to a new way of doing things, to a new way of being. It is a liminal season, to be sure. We cannot continue to do things as we have always done. But the good news is, God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning on the 3rd day. Amen.